So it's typically estimated that the average level of testosterone has dropped by over 1% per year over the past 30 years, which means that the average level of testosterone has dropped by between 30 to 50% over the past 30 years. And so if you are a human with any level of intelligence and awareness, this is extremely alarming to you and is likely happening for several different reasons that we could get into. However, undoubtedly, one of those reasons is what's going into our mouths.
It's one of those delicious falafel hot dogs with cinnamon and bacon on top.
Now, this drop in testosterone is typically calculated by looking at two studies in particular. The first of which is this one, where between the years of 1987 and 2004, the average level of testosterone among men between the ages of 45 and 80 has dropped by about 1% per year. But the other study that appears to be even more alarming is this one, where between the years of 1999 and 2016, that the average level of testosterone has dropped by about 1.8% per year in men of the average age of 27, which seems to indicate two things in particular. One is that the drop in testosterone levels actually appears to be speeding up over time, and the second thing this seems to indicate is that it's actually affecting younger men to a greater degree when compared to older men, and at any rate is extremely alarming considering that it appears to be dropping by at least 1 to 1.8% per year across these demographics. Now, because this appears to be such a massive issue, if you've never had your testosterone levels checked, I would highly recommend doing so just so you can have some hardcore data in your hands as to where your testosterone levels are at. And so if you're interested in something like that, make sure to check out the link in the description for 25% off of an at-home testosterone test with today's video sponsor, Let's Get Checked. Now, aside from the obvious question of where your personal testosterone levels might be, the more obvious question is, why is this trend so prevalent? And there's several possible reasons for this, the least of which not being the dramatic increase in obesity levels over the same time span, as well as just a decrease in a general healthy lifestyle, less sunlight, less movement, more chronic stress. But as the researchers of these studies point out, even when factors like these are controlled for, there still appears to be a dramatic drop in testosterone levels over the past few decades, which seems to indicate that there are some other factors that are contributing to the alarming drop in testosterone levels. And this is where the work of Dr. Anthony J comes in super handy. According to his research, he is convinced that one of the primary drivers of this phenomenon is actually exposure to environmental xenoestrogens. And this brings us to our first major topic of discussion today, which is the avoidance of environmental estrogens. Now, there are two primary categories of environmental estrogens that are related to our topic of conversation today, which are phytoestrogens and xenoestrogens. Now, environmental estrogens as a class of molecules are all similar in that they all appear to act like estrogen in the body to one degree or another. However, the difference here is that phytoestrogens are molecules created by plants, while xenoestrogens are synthetic molecules most often created as a result of plastic manufacturing. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, the reason this is a bad thing is that one of the primary mechanisms by which your body detects how much testosterone produce is via estrogen detection in the brain region of the hypothalamus. And the reason for this is that estrogen is one of the primary metabolites of testosterone, and so when your brain detects that there are abnormally high levels of testosterone, either through actual estrogen or other compounds that act and mimic estrogen, it will actually begin to shut down the production of testosterone as a means to reduce estrogen. Now, when it comes specifically to xenoestrogens, I could go on and on listing all the xenoestrogens that we come into contact with on a regular basis and scare the bejesus out of all of us. However, for the sake of time, the three primary ones that I want to talk about are herbicides, pesticides, and plasticizing agents. Now, if you're interested in learning more about these, I would highly recommend just doing your own research to figure out the specifics of where these are found. However, for the sake of time today, I do want to talk about three ways to avoid the consumption of herbicides, pesticides, and plasticizing agents. And the first way is to just simply buy organic produce and meat. Because industrial herbicides and pesticides are so prevalent in conventionally produced produce and meat products, I do think it would be in the best interest of most guys to opt for organic options. And this is especially the case with meat products, simply because the animals that are fed conventional diets are laced with all these herbicides and pesticides and are actually absorbed absorbed and stored in the fat of these animals. And so when you eat these animals and their fat, you're also consuming the herbicides and pesticides that these animals were consuming as well. And the second way is to just simply avoid plastic when you can. That would mean plastic water bottles, plastic wrapped food, as well as just anything plastic that you find that is coming into contact with your mouth on a regular basis. The sad reality is that a lot of these xenoestrogens can leach from these food and water packagings into our food and water supply, especially when they're heated. And so it's usually going to be in your best interest to avoid these at all costs. And the third and most important way, in my opinion, to avoid xenoestrogen exposure is to just simply filter your drinking water. A lot of our tap water is piped through plastic piping, which can leach into the water supply, as well as being filled with a ton of different chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, and cleaning agents that are used to treat the water, as well as heavy metals such as fluoride that can also have a detrimental effect on testosterone levels. And so in my opinion, filtering your drinking water is a non-negotiable when it comes to optimizing testosterone levels, and I would highly recommend looking into something like a reverse osmosis system, or just simply purchasing reverse osmosis water from the store in order to avoid the exposure from tap water. Now, aside from xenoestrogens, I think it's also worth mentioning phytoestrogens here. Now, phytoestrogens don't appear to be as potent as estrogen receptor agonists when compared to things like xenoestrogens. However, they do appear to have some level of estrogenic activity. Now, there's a lot of debate within the scientific community whether or not this is like a pro-estrogenic effect or an anti-estrogenic effect. However, when you look at some more controlled data in rodents, phytoestrogens do appear to have some level of estrogenic activity as well as some anti-androgenic activity, and may actually hinder testicular function. Now, things like flax and soy tend to get a lot of attention for their phytoestrogenic activity. However, almost every plant food contains phytoestrogen to one degree or another. Things like legumes and fruits, as well as grains and tubers and leafy vegetables. And so anything pretty much that has a high level of polyphenol content also typically has a high level of phytoestrogenic activity as well. Now, there's not quite enough clinical data yet to make a definitive conclusion as to whether or not phytoestrogens are absolutely detrimental to testicular function and testosterone levels. However, there is enough evidence to suggest that you might want to be mindful of your intake and limit your intake to some degree just to be cautious, or at the very least use traditional food preparation techniques such as soaking and sprouting and fermenting that might actually lower the polyphenol and phytoestrogenic activity of some of the plant foods that you might be consuming on a regular basis. Now, the next thing I want to talk about for a good portion of this video is macronutrients, starting with a conversation on calorie intake. Now, calories are technically defined as a unit of energy often used to express the nutritional value of foods and is equivalent to the heat energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. And at a fundamental level, calories are the most essential nutrients for the human body. Now, technically, calories aren't a nutrient per se, but rather a unit of energy that can be derived from a macronutrient such as protein, fats, and carbohydrates. However, nonetheless, calories are one of the most essential needs for the human body. Now, when it comes to calories and testosterone levels, there are typically two things to keep in mind here. And the first one is that if you consume too few calories for too long, testosterone levels will typically drop. Now, the reason for this is somewhat intuitive. Reproduction is one of your most primal drives. However, your most primal drive is survival. And so when your body senses that there is a lack of energy intake, it will begin to divert physiological resources to the acquisition of resources and food as opposed to reproduction. It's kind of hard to reproduce if you're dead, and so your body will begin to prioritize survival over reproduction when energy intake is fairly low for extended periods of time. However, it's also worth noting that according to some research, this isn't always necessarily the case, especially for men that have a especially high body fat percentage for those guys that go into a calorie deficit and begin to restrict energy intake. These guys may not actually experience a hit to their testosterone levels, and on the contrary, might actually experience an increase in testosterone levels. Now, the question is often asked, at what point does an individual go from experiencing an increase in testosterone while losing weight to a point where they begin to experience a decrease in testosterone from a lack of calories and energy input? And to be quite frank, this is largely dependent on several genetic factors as well as environmental factors, and is largely dependent on your genetic set point for body fat. And so the main thing to keep in mind here is that what you want to shoot for is just simply a healthy body fat percentage. Now, it is worth noting that the vast majority of guys should be a little bit more worried about losing weight than getting too low. There's not a ton of guys that are that should be worried about having too low of a body fat percentage. Maybe if you're super young or kind of going into a bodybuilding competition, you might have to worry about something like that. But by and large, most guys have some body fat to lose. And the reason your body fat is such a big issue here is, one, body fat is a hyper expressor of the enzyme aromatase. Now, aromatase is the enzyme that converts testosterone into estrogen in the body. And again, kind of going back to the concept that we were talking about with xenoestrogens, when you have a lot of estrogen in the body, it will bind to receptors in the hypothalamus and signal to your brain to shut down the production of testosterone. And so you want a healthy balance and ratio of testosterone to estrogen. And when you are overexpressing this enzyme, the aromatase enzyme, and it can over-converts testosterone into estrogen, it kind of signals to your brain to shut down the production of testosterone, which in the long run is not a good thing. And the second reason you want to keep your body fat percentage in check is that when your body fat percentage goes up, general metabolic dysfunction also goes up. You're going to have a reduced sensitivity of insulin receptors. You're going to have elevated blood sugar. You're going to have elevated blood lipids. You're going to have just elevated inflammatory markers as well, all of which will have a negative impact on testosterone in the long run. And because of all these reasons, if you are carrying a little bit of extra body fat or a lot of bit of extra body fat, who knows, one of the best things you can do in order to optimize your testosterone levels is just to simply lose some of that extra weight. And now, while we're on the topic of calories, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the ever trending topic of fasting. And when it comes to the research that has been performed on the relationship between fasting and testosterone levels, it is a little bit scant, but from what we have currently, it does not appear as though fasting or long-term fasting in particular has a substantial effect on testosterone levels. Now, it is worth noting that after a refeeding, after a long-term fast, there does appear to be a rebound in and an increase in testosterone levels. However, there are a few caveats here. One is that there is a massive drop in testosterone levels during a long-term fast. Two is that there's no indication that the refeeding rebound in testosterone levels and the increase that happens after a fast and after a refeeding is actually sustained. And then the third caveat here is that when you go on a long-term fast, you're actually going to lose a ton of muscle mass. And so there's no indication that a long-term fast can have a long-term impact on testosterone levels. And in my opinion, is not really an effective way in order to optimize testosterone levels. But what about intermittent fasting, you might ask? And well, I'm glad you did, because there is absolutely zero evidence to suggest that intermittent fasting would have a positive impact on testosterone either. And actually, to the contrary, almost all of the research that's been performed on this subject shows that intermittent fasting has a somewhat consistent negative impact on testosterone levels. Now, it's not exactly clear if this is caused by the calorie deficit that intermittent fasting encourages. However, at the very least, we can conclude that that intermittent fasting doesn't have an inherent ability to increase testosterone levels. Now, if you have a lot of body fat to lose, long-term fasting and intermittent fasting might be an effective way to quickly lose some body fat in order to help to optimize your testosterone levels in the future. However, for the average guy that is metabolically healthy, is relatively active, there is no indication that long-term fasting and intermittent fasting is going to have a long-term impact on testosterone levels. Now, with calories being covered, I do want to talk about the three macronutrients: proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And the first one we're going to talk about is protein. Now, protein appears to be the most straightforward macronutrient in regards to its effects on testosterone, and appears to be super similar to calories in that when you consume too much protein, testosterone levels appear to drop, and when you consume too little protein, testosterone levels appear to drop. Now, the reason that consuming not enough protein tends to decrease testosterone levels is similar to when you're not eating enough calories. When you don't eat enough protein, your body is requiring some specific amino acids, and it will put your body into a state of stress, and it will release cortisol to do two things. One is to extract amino acids out of your body tissues in order to fuel specific bodily functions, and the second reason is to encourage a state of stress in order to encourage you physiologically to go out and search and hunt for those resources that your body is requiring. And so when your body does this, it is going to prioritize that stressful state in order to prioritize survival over reproduction. And so ensuring that you're getting enough amino acids and enough protein is going to be a super basic way in order to signal to your brain and signal to your body that your body is ready for reproduction. Now, how much protein you actually need in order to prevent a drop in testosterone levels is somewhat up for debate. However, in general, you want to ensure that you're eating enough protein to prevent lean tissue loss. When you are losing lean tissue, it is a sign that you are in a stressful state and that your body is catabolizing lean tissue for the essential amino acids that it needs, and is also a sign that you're likely experiencing a drop in testosterone levels. But with that being said, it's also worth noting that eating too much protein can also cause a drop in testosterone levels, even though the reasoning here is a little bit less straightforward. It appears as though when your protein intake begins to reach roughly 3.4 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, or approaches 40% of your daily caloric intake per day, that testosterone levels do begin to drop. And the reasoning for this is as you begin to reach extreme levels of protein intake, it will begin to nudge out other nutrients like fat and carbohydrates. And the reason this is bad for testosterone production is your body uses fats and carbohydrates to produce energy, whereas it uses proteins to build things. Now, when you aren't consuming enough carbohydrates and fat, it essentially signals to your body that you're in an energy restrictive state, and thereby kind of causes the same phenomenon that you would experience with low calorie intake. And so the best thing to do here is just to ensure that you, one, are not going over 3.4 grams per kilogram of body weight in protein per day, as well as staying under 40% of your caloric intake from protein sources. Now, before we move on to fats, I do think it's also worth discussing protein sources, namely animal sources of protein versus plant sources of protein. And the main thing to keep in mind here is that animal sources of protein do appear to be far more beneficial and superior to plant sources of protein. And the reason for this is that there are several amino acids that are exclusively found in animal products, or are found in somewhat higher quantities in animal products. Amino acids such as creatine and taurine and carnosine and anserine, as well as hydroxyproline and histidine and methionine and cysteine. And so there's all these amino acids that are found abundantly in animal products, just simply aren't found in abundance in plant sources of protein. And so when you're developing a diet, I do think it's far more beneficial to base the foundation of your diet off of animal sources of protein, simply because there's going to be a ton of amino acids that may actually actually in and of themselves have some beneficial effects on testosterone, but at the very least are going to have some beneficial effects on just overall health. Now, the next macronutrient we're going to be talking about is fat, and this is actually one of the more interesting topics that we're going to be talking about today, simply because one, the relationship between fat intake and testosterone levels is fairly solidified in the scientific literature. However, what's not solidified is exactly why there is such a strong correlation between fat intake and testosterone levels. Now, when you look at all the research that's been performed on the relationship between fat intake and testosterone, what you'll notice is that low-fat diets always have a negative impact on testosterone. And even on the flip side of this, very high-fat diets also appear to have a positive influence on testosterone. However, it's not exactly clear why yet. Now, one of the things that you'll notice when you look at all the studies that have been performed on the relationship between testosterone and fat intake is that none of the studies really control variables very well. What you'll notice is that, yes, they do decrease the fat intake in the experimental groups, but they also increase the fiber intake, they decrease the saturated fat intake, as well as increase the polyunsaturated fat intake, all of which might actually be leading to this drop in testosterone that these studies are observing. Now, one of the leading theories on why these dietary trends tend to decrease testosterone is that when you increase fiber intake, when you decrease saturated fat intake and increase polyunsaturated fat intake, all of these decrease total cholesterol, serum cholesterol levels, which cholesterol being the primary building block of sex hormones in the body will have a negative impact on testosterone levels. And so the moral of the story here is that you want to prioritize your fat intake, and especially saturated fats from animal products. Because polyunsaturated fats can lead to a drop in serum cholesterol levels and lead to drops in testosterone. Because of that, it probably would be in your best interest to eliminate, or at the very least minimize, the consumption of polyunsaturated fats from plant oils, and to again maximize the amount of animal fats and saturated fats that you're getting into your diet on a daily basis. Now, it's hard to talk about protein and fats without also talking about carbohydrates, and this is where things tend to get a little bit hairy, and to be quite frank, my opinions on this topic have somewhat changed and gone back and forth over the years. However, the general consensus is that carbohydrates don't appear to have any notable effect on resting testosterone levels. However, there is a little bit of nuance here. Now, one study in particular that I want to lean on heavily here is this one in particular that found that when comparing a low carbohydrate diet to a high carbohydrate diet, that there is no notable difference in testosterone levels. Now, it is commonly thought, as I used to think, that a low carbohydrate diet would have a negative impact on testosterone levels, as well as an increase on cortisol levels. However, according to that meta-analysis, this only happens in the first 3 weeks of a low carbohydrate diet, after which testosterone levels begin to normalize, as well as cortisol levels. And on the flip side of this, there's actually some interesting evidence to suggest that a super low carbohydrate diet might actually have beneficial effects on testosterone levels long-term in young, healthy athletes. And so I don't think the evidence on the relationship between carbohydrate intake and testosterone levels is completely clear yet, so it's kind of hard to make a definitive statement as to what any one particular individual should do. However, it is also worth noting that high carbohydrate intake and elevated blood sugar does appear to have some notable negative impacts on testosterone levels, at least acutely. But elevated blood sugar has also been shown to acutely increase prolactin levels, hinder gonadotropic releasing hormone, as well as hinder luteinizing hormone function. Now, again, these are only temporary decreases in gonadotropin and testosterone output and don't appear to have a overall effect on resting testosterone levels. However, one of the bigger issues that I personally have with carbohydrate intake doesn't have to do with the blood sugar per se, but actually has to do with the polyphenol content of carbohydrates. As we previously discussed, polyphenols have a somewhat notable phytoestrogenic activity to them. However, they also appear to have some fairly anti-androgenic activity as well by inhibiting the 5-alpha reductase enzyme, as well as having some negative interactions and impacts on the androgen receptor as well. And so because of this, I've actually over the years become somewhat of a fan of a lower carbohydrate diet, simply because one, a low carbohydrate diet and a high fat diet doesn't appear to have a negative impact on testosterone levels. Two, because temporary elevation of blood sugar does appear to have a temporary detrimental effect on gonadotropin and testosterone output. And three, because of the anti-androgenic nature of the polyphenols that are found in many of the carb-heavy food products that you would typically eat. Now, this is by no means a blanket statement or a blanket recommendation for everyone. I do believe that carbohydrates can play a significant role in athletic performance to some degree, especially in instances where athletes are training for several hours a day or are training every single day and don't have enough time to replenish their glycogen stores between training sessions. I do think carbohydrates, some low polyphenol carbohydrates, things like honey and maple syrup, as well as white rice, white potatoes, white bread, things of that nature can be leveraged in order to help replenish glycogen stores. But in general, for most individuals that aren't training for several hours a day, I do think that a lot of guys can get away with the benefits of experiencing a low carbohydrate diet and experiencing some improvements in testosterone production because of it. And so there you have it for macronutrients. And so now that we've covered macronutrients, I do want to cover micronutrients. And when we start to talk about micronutrients, there's usually three primary categories of micronutrients that you want to talk about. One is fat-soluble vitamins, two is water-soluble vitamins, and then the third category is mineral intake. Now, I don't have enough time to do a deep dive into all of the water-soluble vitamins, fat-soluble vitamins, and minerals and their specific impact on testosterone production. However, they are worth talking about more on a broader level. And so the first category I want to talk about, again, is the fat-soluble vitamins, and these would be your vitamins like A, D, E, and K. And the first thing to note here is that pretty much all of your fat-soluble vitamins and to some degree your water-soluble vitamins appear to have a beneficial effect on testosterone production. There are some specific vitamins, things like vitamin D, that get a ton of attention for their supposed effects on testosterone production. However, all of your fat-soluble vitamins and all of your vitamins just in general appear to have some degree of importance when it comes to regulating testicular function and regulating the production of testosterone, as well as regulating some of the receptors that go along with testosterone. Now, again, I don't have the time to go in depth on every single one of these and their specific effects on testosterone. However, one of the main things to keep in mind here is how to get enough of these nutrients into your diet. And by and large, it is impossible to meet your needs of specifically vitamin D, vitamin K, and vitamin A without the consumption of fatty animal products, things like red meat, things like fish and eggs and full-fat dairy. Without the consumption of these food products in your diet and the prioritization of them in your diet, it's impossible to meet your needs. And so, in my opinion, one of the best ways to meet your dietary needs for these vitamins is just to simply include fatty animal products into your diet. Now, when it comes to water-soluble vitamins, things are a little bit different. You can meet your dietary needs of water-soluble vitamins, all of your B vitamins 1 through 12, things like choline, as well as vitamin C. You can meet your dietary needs of these vitamins through the consumption of plant foods. However, the same issue arises when you start start to consume a lot of these plant foods, and in order to meet your dietary needs of these water-soluble vitamins with plant foods, you're also going to be consuming a lot of polyphenols, a lot of fiber, which are going to have some negative anti-androgenic and possibly phytoestrogenic activity in the body. And so, in my opinion, one of the best ways to meet your dietary needs of all of your water-soluble vitamins is to simply also prioritize the consumption of nutrient-dense animal products as well. All of these foods do contain a lot of your fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. And so again, one of the easiest ways to meet your dietary needs of these nutrients is just to simply prioritize these foods into your diet. Now, I also want to touch on minerals as well, things like magnesium and zinc and boron, iodine, potassium, things of this nature. There are a handful of minerals, not just the ones that I just mentioned, but a handful of minerals that have been shown to have a positive impact on testosterone production, testicular function, positive impacts on the androgen receptor density. And so consuming enough minerals can also be done by the consumption of plant foods. However, again, you run into the issue of consuming a lot of fiber and a lot of polyphenols that are going to have that phytoestrogenic and anti-estrogenic capacity. However, an additional negative side effect of consuming a lot of plant foods in order to meet your mineral intake is that plant foods that are high in minerals are also extremely high in oxalates, phytates, and lectins, which have gotten a lot of attention lately, but are essentially molecules that plants use in order to store these minerals. Now, the issue here is that we lack the enzymes that are required to cleave minerals from phytates, oxalates, and lectins. And so when you consume plant matter that is high in these mineral content, you just don't absorb it. And so again, the best way to consume these minerals is actually through the consumption of nutrient-dense animal foods. But with that being said, there are two exceptions to this rule, and that are magnesium and boron. And the reason for this is that magnesium and boron are not found in super high quantities in meat products, but are also not well absorbed through plant products, which has led me to believe that magnesium and boron are actually two minerals that historically have been consumed through the consumption of mineral-dense spring waters. When you look at a lot of the spring waters that are found globally, what you'll notice is that a lot of them are super high in magnesium and are super high in boron. And because these two minerals in particular appear to have some specifically beneficial effects on testosterone production, I do think that magnesium and boron are actually two minerals that should be supplemented. Now, ideally, you would consume just a lot of spring water that has a lot of magnesium and boron in it. However, a lot of people don't have access to high quality spring water, and so adding a little bit of magnesium, liquid magnesium and liquid boron into your water on a daily basis can be a really effective and historically accurate way to ingest magnesium without having to consume a ton of plant products in order to attempt to meet your needs of these minerals. And this actually brings us nicely into our last topic of discussion today, which is supplementation. Now, I have said a ton over the years on various supplements that can be used and leveraged to optimize testosterone production. However, when complemented with a nutrient-dense diet, I do think it's worth noting that supplements usually aren't necessary long-term. Now, again, there are some supplements that can be used in the short term to help to kind of correct some deficiencies maybe, or to reduce stress markers and parameters to help optimize testosterone production. But long term, these typically aren't necessary if you are properly optimizing your diet. Now, as I talk about in the complete guide to supplementation, I typically divide supplements into one of two categories. One is essential foundational nutrients that your body absolutely needs in order to operate properly. Again, things like vitamins and minerals, fatty acids, amino acids, things of that nature. If your body is deficient in any of these or insufficient in any of these, restoring the sufficiency through supplementation can have a positive impact on testosterone levels. And then the second category are things that I like to call complementary supplements, things that are typically herbal in nature and have historically been looked at as medicinal medicinal in nature. Now, when it comes to complementary supplements, I do think there's only really a handful that show a lot of promise, things like ashwagandha, tongkat, and shilajit. However, the guys that are going to experience the most benefit from this are going to be individuals that are hypogonadal, guys that are already infertile. And even though there is some research to suggest that healthy men might experience a increase in testosterone from using compounds like these, this increase does appear to be temporary in most situations. And when you compound that with the fact that most of these supplements have to be cycled in order to avoid side effects, I just don't think that herbal supplementation is an effective long-term strategy. Again, they can be used in order to reverse some symptoms of stress that might be causing a drop in testosterone levels for a short period of time. However, again, long-term, the most beneficial and effective strategy is going to be simply prioritizing nutrient-dense foods, prioritizing, again, things like sleep, avoiding foods that are going to have a negative impact on testosterone production, things that are high in fiber, things that are high in polyphenol content. And by and large, by doing this, you will optimize your testosterone levels to a place where you don't even actually need some of these herbal supplements. Now, with all of this being said, I do want to kind of conclude with this. One is that I'm a fairly big fan of prioritizing almost exclusively animal products in your diet. I do believe that you can get literally every nutrient that you need, every amino acid, every fatty acid, every vitamin, and every mineral that you need from these animal products. And by doing so, you will decrease your fiber intake, decrease your polyunsaturated fat intake, as well as your polyphenol intake, all of which appear to have some positive impacts on fertility and testicular function, as well as testosterone production and androgen status. And so by and large, following a diet that is largely carnivorous in nature might end up actually being the most beneficial diet for androgen status. But that's all I have for this video, guys. I want to give a huge shout out to Barbell Apparel, as well as Let's Get Checked for sponsoring this video. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below, and I think I'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much.